Hey guys, it's Dawn and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Well, NaNoWriMo is just around the corner, which means you're probably busy planning and prepping for your project. So if you're trying to write your very first novel next month, you might be struggling a little bit with your outlining process. One thing I noticed myself doing in the past is I would have a very easy time outlining the beginning of the book and perhaps the end, but I didn't know how to approach the middle and it felt very intimidating. So a lot of times I just said I'd figure it out later. Well, the reality is later happens when you're in the middle of NaNoWriMo and you're very tired and burnt out and you don't have the creative energy to go from fast drafting what you did outline to hitting the middle section and then trying to turn around and outline and draft at the same time. So either you give up or you pants it and you end up writing something that isn't super usable for you later. So if you want to avoid that and you want to have the best outline you can so that you have a very successful NaNoWriMo, keep on watching this video.
Step one of my process is to brainstorm the premise of your story. So chances are up until this point, you have a lot of ideas in your head about the story. You've pictured a lot of the scenes, characters, and settings, etc. But you haven't really had the chance to articulate it yet, to really tell yourself, what the heck is this story about? And so I think this is a valuable first step to take because it kind of forces you to get into the mode of actually defining the story. So let's start by just brainstorming a premise. So a lot of times in our premise, we'll start with sort of stating who our main character or main characters are. So like here, I say that Hannah is a normal 6th grader. She loves hanging out with her friends, playing volleyball, and is really good at history and English. But that's not really a story, right? We want to get to what's actually going on, what's going to change in Hannah's life to make it a little bit more crazy. So let's say one day at recess, Hannah notices a strange boy waving at her from the nearby woods. She investigates and finds out he is a goblin prince from the magical realm, looking for help to save his people from an evil dragon. So then Hannah agrees to follow him to his parents' kingdom and finds herself in a strange world. She meets a kooky wizard who helps her unlock her powers, giving her the tools to defeat the evil dragon at the end. So you can see there's a lot of holes in this premise. Like I don't really explain, well, how does the kooky wizard teach her to unlock her powers? What happens between that and her actually defeating the evil dragon? But you don't have to get into all that detail yet if you don't know it. The purpose of writing a premise is just to sort of establish for yourself concretely, what is this story about? What am I aiming towards? Another useful thing to do at this point is to sort of set what you think your character's opening image and ending image will be. So in other words, the start and end of their character arc. If you have multiple main characters, do this with all of them, but I just have the one main character. So just drawing from what I already wrote in the premise, I've got sort of my starting point for my main character, Hannah, that she's a normal 6th grader, yada, yada, yada. And then the ending I imagine for her is that she is knighted by the Goblin King and Queen for her courage and sacrifice in fighting the evil dragon. So obviously there's a lot that needs to happen in between the start and end of her character arc. But once again, this is just a useful tool to help us begin to establish what our goals are in writing this story. In other words, what scenes we need to write in order to get Hannah from being just a normal 6th grader to her being a knight. If it's helpful for you, go ahead and write several different iterations of the premise, get into detail, tweak things, whatever you need to do. But if you feel like you get to a good place where you've kind of told yourself a decent idea of what you think your story is going to be about, go ahead and leave it here. Step 2 of my method is to build the skeleton of your story. I find it's easiest to do this with some sort of note card. So if you have a program like Scrivener or any other program, or if you have physical note cards, that works just as well. The reason I like to use note cards is because they're a lot lower pressure than an actual outline, and it's very easy to move things around. At the beginning of the outlining process, you really just want to give yourself a lot of flexibility to discover the story. So I find that using this sort of format helps with that. So let's just put a bunch of note cards here on my corkboard. I've found that a lot of times when I'm first developing a story, I already sort of know what the inciting incident is and what the climax is generally going to look like. So that's a good place to start. So let's say my inciting incident is Hannah meets the goblin, and my climax, which honestly will probably be several scenes. Most climaxes are, but for now we're going to keep it simple and just say what the general idea of the climax is, which is Hannah fights the evil dragon. Now, if you're anything like me, you also have a lot of scenes that you've already pictured writing. Maybe you don't know exactly where they fall in the timeline of the story, but you have them very vividly in your mind. You're very excited about writing them. You feel like they serve an important purpose in the story. So now is the time to add those scenes to your corkboard. Don't stress about putting them in any particular order. That's the beauty of the corkboard. So just put them all out there. If you have an idea of the order, go ahead and put them in that order if you want, but don't stress about it if you're not sure yet. Okay, so let's say I've written down all the scenes that I've pictured so far. Now is a good time to try to put them in order if you can, but once again, if that's not possible, if you're not sure where something is, just put it where you generally think it will be and you can always move it later. So like this one's obvious. Meet the Wizard and training montage probably happen back to back. Hannah fights the evil dragon is going to be towards the end, probably before she's knighted. The sort of fun stuff and experiencing this new magical world will probably happen somewhere in the first half of the book. We'll put it before meeting the wizard, maybe. Giving up and going home is something that's going to happen after she attempts to defend a village and fails. She receives a pep talk from the goblin she met at the beginning because she gave up and went home, and he really needs her to come back and fight the dragon. So basically add every scene idea that you already have, everything that already comes easy to you, and just get it put down. So unfortunately, step 3 is where the work begins, because we need to start filling in the gaps between the scenes we have already put down on the corkboard. In particular, the most difficult section for most people is going to be the middle section. It's often quite muddy for people. They don't have a lot of ideas for it when they first come up with their story. And it's not always the most exciting part of the book to write anyways. So that is definitely somewhere that you're going to want to give a lot of attention to in this outlining process so that you'll be more successful writing your first draft when you actually start it. So the way I approach this section is by sort of approaching it piece by piece. So for example, I'm going to start with my first scene that I have here, which is my inciting incident. And I know that there's things that happen before my inciting incident. So I need to ask myself, okay, what needs to happen to the character before she meets the goblin? So I add an opening scene sort of showing Hannah in her home environment before she meets the goblin. Once you feel like that gap is filled in, you move on to the next gap. So that would be from this point to this point in the story. And you just keep doing that bit by bit. There's going to be some where there's only one scene in between the two scenes, and there's going to be others, like probably right here, the training montage and defending the village, where there's going to be several scenes similar to what we did at the beginning. Probably there's going to be sort of a scene at the end showing what everything looks like after all is said and done. The point of this step, filling in these gaps, is just to get to a point where you feel like you don't have any gaping holes in the story. Sure, there's going to be spots you run into where you're not really sure how to bridge one scene to another, but for the most part, you should fill in everything at this point. It can always be changed later and rearranged, but you want a relatively complete overview of your story. I find that it's helpful to set goals for yourself. So if you look at this and you find it a bit overwhelming, you think there's a lot of things that need to be added, just tell yourself that, okay, in this writing session, I'm going to fill in the gap between this scene and this scene, and that's all you focus on for this writing session. Let's say you have another scene or another pair of scenes that have a lot that needs to happen between them. So you just make the goal, well, I'm going to add 3 note cards during this writing session. But definitely try to approach it in a more manageable way and don't look at it as all of the process at once, because that can be very overwhelming. And like I said before, really try to focus on your middle section, because that is the most difficult part to outline, and getting that done now, or at least getting a sort of skeleton of that part now, will help you so much when you're actually drafting in the future. Now, step 4 is another rather intensive step, and this is to add detail. Now, it's up to you how you want to do it. Some people like to add detail to the note cards themselves, so you can do that physically, or like here on Scrivener, you can add it to these digital cards, but I actually like to write a long form outline in a document. There's no one right way to do an outline. So some people do a lot of levels, going from numbers to letters to numbers to letters and just going super into detail. Whereas I really just like to do one bullet point or number per scene and just add detail in a paragraph form. It's really up to you and what's pleasing to your eye and easy for you to use. So I start out with just sort of a scene title or very brief scene descriptor that will help me know which scene this is. And I find that it's easiest for me just to copy it from what we did in step 2 and 3. So once you've transferred all of your scenes from your brainstorming and note card process over to your outline, you can start adding detail. So I usually just tab to the next level and I write, like I said, like a paragraph, maybe a couple sentences, whatever, as much detail as I have ready right now in my mind, and I add that to each scene. Adding detail to your outline helps you notice missing pieces that didn't stand out to you when you were doing this process. So let's say I'm adding detail to this opening scene and I realize I need another connection to get me to this next scene. This is the place to add that detail. Sometimes I even realize, oh shoot, I actually need another scene that I hadn't even come up with in this part of the process. And so you can add it here. If you want to be really thorough, you can go add it to your note cards, whatever works for you. This part of the process doesn't have to be all done in one day. In fact, I think that would actually be a lot of work to do an entire outline in one day, adding all that detail to all your scenes. So once again, don't be afraid to make daily goals for yourself. So for one writing session, you could say, I want to add detail to 3 scenes or 5 scenes or all of Act 1 or whatever. But make sure you have goals and you're doing it in an approachable way so that you don't overwhelm yourself and that you actually better enable yourself to write a full finished outline. Steps 3 and 4 are probably the longest parts of the process, but they are so worth it. The more work that you put into these steps, the more you're going to help yourself when you're actually drafting. At the end of the day, the point of an outline is to help you write a more effective first draft. So if you're somebody who doesn't want to do horrible, giant amounts of developmental editing later on, it definitely pays off to do a lot of that legwork in the outlining phase. Whereas if you're someone who doesn't mind writing something closer to a 0 draft as your first finished draft, then it's okay to not put as much detail in the outlining process. It's really just up to you and your own preferences and what you know about yourself as a writer. And finally, step 5, which is finishing touches. This is a relatively short step depending on how you approach it because it sort of depends on what sort of details you want to add as your finishing touches. So one of my favorite things to do is actually to tell myself what the purpose of each scene is. So for example, let's do Hannah meets the goblin. This is the inciting incident. So I tell myself that. I also tell myself that it introduces the Goblin Prince. That's super important. He's a main character. In fantasy and science fiction, you're going to be doing a lot of world building. It's really helpful on your different scenes that are going to have world building to remind yourself what specific element is going to be touched on. So for example, when Hannah meets the wizard, we're probably going to be learning a lot about the magic system. And you can go into more detail here, say like magic system, fighting spells, defensive spells, whatever. A lot of stories also have B plot lines or secondary plot lines. So if you have a scene that's really not related to the main plot line, but it advances the secondary plot line, definitely make a note of that in your purpose description. So I do that for all of my scenes, and one of the reasons I think it's useful, other than just helping me keep organized, is that sometimes I come to a scene that I thought was really important, but when I sit down and try to define what exactly it adds to the main storyline or the secondary storyline, I realize that it doesn't actually do anything. So that's the signal that I either need to put something in there that will add to the story or that it might be a scene that needs to be cut. So I find that it just sort of helps me identify those issues before I even start writing. Something that could also be helpful for you is color coding. So you could make all your world building scenes purple and all your B storyline scenes green or whatever. If you're a very visual person, that might be helpful to you. Now, once my outline is totally finished, or at least I feel like it's in a good place, I print it out. As I'm writing my story, if I make changes or notice issues, I can make notes on the document I printed out. If you like to be really thorough, you can always go back to your digital outline and fix it there as well. But for me personally, I don't mind just writing notes on the physical document.
And that concludes all the steps of my revised outlining method. I hope you find this useful as you prepare for NaNoWriMo, or if you're watching this at another time of the year, I hope it helps you in whatever you're writing right now. If you're interested in seeing more writing related content from me, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Let me know what you thought of the video down below in the comments and share any tips and tricks you have with other people. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you have a successful Preptober in NaNoWriMo and an amazing rest of your week. And as always, happy writing. Bye.